Now that I've spent 300 plus hours in SSFHC, I can tell you it's definitely possible to get straight into that game mode, and I feel like I'm in a bit of a position to answer some questions I had when starting out and give a few suggestions for your SSFHC journey. So here are my 7 tips for new Path of Exile 2 SSFHC players in somewhat of an order of importance. So the first tip is to think of progress in the game as progressing your stash, the things you don't lose if your character dies, rather than progression of your character itself. You will most likely lose many characters on your way to killing pinnacle bosses, and that can be a demotivational thought in reality, but if you just think about your stash and how your next character is going to be better, it helps a lot with the mental aspects of losing characters and adds some feelings of reward and satisfaction depending on how far a particular character makes it. Every time you restart, it will be easier and faster to get to the point where your previous character died, so just try to get further every time. For example, my stash has a bunch of items that will make it way easier for me to level any ES based like caster character in the future. Okay, so the second tip is for fellow min-maxers out there, and this is something I've struggled with a lot in action RPGs because I've always been a WoW DPS player, and so I want to use my abilities as effectively as possible to do as much damage as possible in bosses. But this is not a great way to play bosses on Path of Exile or any action RPG actually, because it leaves you vulnerable to getting hit. It's way better to damage a boss slowly and focus on survival. This also means that if you have a slightly convoluted damage combo, you may want to strip away some of the abilities and use less of them to kill a boss, even if it's slightly slower. So for example, if you have 3 abilities in your combo, you may want to just use 2 of them, or 1. Okay, so the third tip is one that I would have massively appreciated some answers to back when I was starting out. I had massive questions about how I should build in hardcore because all of the guides I found were softcore oriented. Now it's kind of a no-brainer that you want to get defensives on your gear and cap your resistances ASAP, but how much do you invest defensively on your passive tree? As all the regular guides just go full damage at the beginning. Well, this is pretty simple actually. Most guides will have defensive investments, but later on in the build. So you can just look at which defensive nodes the build guide takes and invest in them when you think you need it, rather than when the guide suggests, which might be way earlier. You can also pick defensive nodes yourself. Don't be afraid to stray from the guides. The more defense you take on the passive tree, the less damage you're gonna do, and over time you'll be fine-tuning the balance of defensive stats on gear versus defensive nodes on the tree. Here's how I usually build on a sorceress. So first off, I'll go and find a build guide for the build I want to play or level with. So let's say it's a Spark Sorceress. Spark Stormweaver leveling guide. And this is kind of the issue that I had, right? I'd search for this leveling guide or build guide and I'd see this, right? And I go like, okay, there's like damage nodes, a tiny bit of ES over here, and everything is damage. And I'm like, well, is this suitable for hardcore? Probably not. So what the hell do I do? You can roughly follow this guide for softcore and, you know, put in defensive nodes as you see fit. So it's actually pretty straightforward. Then, you know, I go and build my guy like, okay, I put ES to begin with because I want to have more confidence because I'm not that confident in dodging big boss abilities. And then, you know, I want a bit of damage. So I go for example, cast speed and some damage nodes. And then let's say I feel like, okay, I'm getting chunked quite a bit. I want more defensives. I put a bit more energy shield nodes. And then I roughly, you know, I look at where this build goes. So I go back in time, and I think the crux is at like level 30-ish, where you really begin thinking about your build and how many offensive versus defensive nodes you have. And over here we can see that the build guide for softcore will go just pure damage, pure damage, pure damage. Now I do want to build in the same direction to have the important damage nodes, but I also want survivability nodes. And it's completely fine that you get slowed down by putting more stuff in defensives, as long as you're aware like, okay, I'm going for this node, and on the way I'm going to get, you know, exploit the elements over here, and maybe skill effect duration, although you can sacrifice this. I put in some ES, and then I go, okay, now I'm pathing where the build guide suggests in terms of damage, and I get these nodes, and then, you know, suddenly I'm late Act 2 or something, or middle of Act 2, and I feel like I need more survivability, so, you know, I get a little bit more ES recharge, and now I'm thinking, although this may be inefficient, but again, it's whatever gets you through the campaign, you know? And the farther you get through and the more of these you make, the more you'll start to understand where you need to put points. So I got more ES, and, you know, I keep following the guide. Let's say because now I'm behind offensively, because I invested so much into defense, I may want to skip through the stuff that gives me, like skill effect duration affects your DPS, but maybe I want to get the bigger damage nodes. And again, this isn't Maybe this isn't optimal in terms of damage, but it doesn't really matter that much. You can't make mistakes that are huge. Like, this is not a huge mistake, even if it is a mistake. Even if bosses take you slightly longer, it's not a huge deal as long as you can survive them. And let's say I got here, right? I'm somewhere in Act 3 or something, and again, I'm scared of the monkey boss or some other boss that does a lot of damage. Well, I may want to go and stray from the guide a bit and invest, 4 or 5 points here to get a lot more ES. So this is a lot more ES. And then I'm like, okay, I'll follow the guide. I think it goes something like this. I don't know exactly. But this is the idea. Or if you're a really good player and you're really confident in dodging boss abilities and you're confident in not dying and you want a little bit more risk-reward situation, you can just follow the guide 1-to-1. That's completely fine, especially if you have some nice gear. Okay, so the next tip is all about grinding. And as everyone knows, action RPGs are all about the grind. When I was just starting out, I full cleared every zone with the thinking that I want to be as high level as possible to increase my chances of survival and get as many resources as possible. But now what I do is skip through zones that are inefficient for my build to farm, and farm zones again and again that are efficient in every act. I would say farming is mostly for orbs and XP, but you can also get lucky with some items for your character or one of your future characters, so be sure to save nice items, even if they're not for your specific character at the moment. Now what I do is, once I'm 1 to 2 to 3 levels under the zone I'm currently in, I go back to an efficient zone to farm up a level or two. In this case, efficient means you can kill large packs of enemies and a bunch of rares that are kind of guaranteed, and or a boss. My favorite zones for this so far is the Red Veil in Act 1, especially in Cruel mode. This feels really efficient, and the King in the Mist is just an easy boss for my build to kill. I generally skip farming in Act 2 as I don't like any of the zones for this purpose, and I know Keth or the Lost City is something suggested by many players, but the corridors there make it feel really inefficient. And in Act 3 I farm the Infested Barrens, as you can reliably farm at least 3 rares with large easy packs in between. Overpowering the zone and going back with some item rarity on your gear by sacrificing a bit of defense as my current go-to. But do be careful, don't get complacent, you could die.
Oh, here, I guess we're continuing software. Damn, the lightning got me. Like, rarity farming a low level zone got me.
Okay, so the next tip is one that helps me mentally immensely, and that is planning future characters. You're gonna struggle with getting really good gear and capping your resistances on your first, maybe 2 or 3 characters. And what really helped me was to make other characters. For example, you could finish Act 1 on your first character, keep items that are good for other builds, then level a second character. And this is where it's helpful to think ahead of what other builds you might want to try. For example, if your first character is a sorceress and you get a really nice melee weapon, you could run Act 1 on a different class with that weapon. This will give you a nice break from stressing out about your main character, give you a boost in resources, and have a backup character that's done progress rather than starting on the beach if you die on your main. Okay, so the 6th tip is quite obvious, but I wanted to mention it because it really has more of an impact than I even thought it would. As you progress your current character, you could keep the best items you find for every 5 to 10 levels as leveling sets. That will eventually make leveling future characters a walk in the park, and reduces the number of crafting resources and gold you have to use early on future characters, and you save more exalts for later progress. Having items ready to go for fresh characters is a really nice sense of progression in my opinion, and it really helps you deal with the mental fatigue of dying at a higher level. Okay, so the 7th tip is a little bit unintuitive, and as far as I'm aware, more or less unique to Path of Exile, and that's the fact that you shouldn't feel the need to play a weapon and skill that kind of makes sense for your class. Say if you want to level a sorceress for a spark build, and you have a really nice quarterstaff, like this Pillar of the Caged God. Don't feel like you gotta play spark from level 2. You could make your leveling way faster if you throw on that quarterstaff and some evasion ES hybrid gear and go with quarterstaff skills. It also provides a nice change in scenery and entertains you a little bit because you're doing something quite different. That's exactly what I did when leveling my new future Chronomancer after dying at level 72. Okay, so I actually have a bonus tip for you, and I realized this quite early, but boy does it make a huge difference to how smoothly your campaign goes. Every boss is a chance for you to die, and doing bosses takes time. So if they aren't necessary for progression of the campaign, consider leaving them for later. For example, I would not go do the Worm boss at level 3. I killed the Frost Witch, then the Witch in the Hut and the Bramble boss if I have good gear, Then I go to Red Veil, and only then, if at all, do I go and kill the Worm boss. I do a similar thing with King in the Mist, which has actually killed 2 of my characters, where I go and kill him after I finish the Act 1 final boss, Count Junor. And speaking of bosses and other shit that can brick your run, if you want to minimize your chances of dying, check out my next video where I cover the most rippy bosses and abilities in the game and tell you how I maximize my chances of survival in the campaign. See you there.